Before another thought pulls your attention away, remain here for a moment. Because something has been happening closer to you than you realize, and the truth has not been hidden by distance, strangers, or coincidence. It has been hidden by familiarity. That is what makes this harder to see. The person working against you is not someone you feared. They are not someone whose name would immediately make your heart tense. They are someone who learned how to stand beside you without appearing threatened by your growth. Someone who listened when you spoke about your plans, smiled when you described what you were building, and nodded as though they wanted nothing more than to see you succeed. But beneath that calm surface, another feeling had been growing. Quietly. Carefully. Almost invisibly. It began the moment they realized you were changing in ways they could no longer control. You were becoming more confident. More selective. Less willing to explain yourself. Less dependent on their approval. And though they never said it aloud, your progress made them uncomfortable. Not because your success harmed them, but because it reminded them of everything they had postponed inside themselves. Every time you moved forward, they felt left behind. Every time someone praised you, they felt smaller. Every time you spoke with hope, they heard an accusation that was never there. That is how jealousy often begins. Not with hatred. With comparison. With a silent question that grows sharper over time: why are they becoming what I wanted to become? At first, they tried to ignore it. They told themselves they were happy for you. They repeated your good news to others with a smile. They even defended you in small conversations so no one would suspect the conflict building inside them. But then something shifted. You stopped sharing every detail. You started trusting your own decisions. You began noticing how certain conversations left you doubting yourself. And without realizing it, you created distance. That distance frightened them. They understood that if you kept growing, you might eventually see them clearly. So they began working against you in ways subtle enough to escape notice. A comment here. A delay there. A private doubt placed inside the mind of someone important. Nothing dramatic. Nothing obvious. Just enough to make doors close slowly. Just enough to make people hesitate before trusting you. Just enough to make you wonder whether you were imagining the resistance. Don't skip, because this is where the story quietly begins to reveal its deeper meaning. The betrayal was not built from one cruel act. It was built from many small moments that seemed harmless alone. They would ask questions about your plans, not because they cared, but because they wanted to know where you were most vulnerable. They would praise you in public, then question your judgment in private. They would tell you to be careful, while secretly hoping fear would stop you. And every time something went wrong, they were strangely calm. Too calm. Almost relieved. You may have noticed it before but dismissed it. The way their expression changed when you received good news. The pause before their congratulations. The sudden subject change when others admired you. The strange advice that always seemed to move you away from your strongest opportunities. Those were not random moments. They were fragments of a pattern. A pattern you were never meant to see. But someone else saw it. A quiet observer. A person who had watched the two of you for longer than either of you realized. They noticed how your energy changed after certain conversations. They saw how hopeful you looked before speaking to this person and how uncertain you became afterward. They noticed that every time you began to trust yourself, someone close to you found a way to make you question your instincts. At first, the observer stayed silent. They did not want to interfere. They believed you would recognize the truth when you were ready. But then one evening, after another opportunity slipped away for reasons that made no sense, they decided silence had become dangerous. They sat across from you in a quiet room, their hands folded, their expression heavier than usual. You asked what was wrong. They looked at you for a long moment before answering. "There is something you need to understand," they said softly. The room changed. Not physically. Emotionally. You felt it before you knew what it meant. A warning without panic. A truth without drama. They asked you to think back. To remember who knew about the opportunity before anyone else. Who asked for details. Who encouraged you to wait when acting quickly would have helped. Who later claimed they knew nothing about why the situation changed. Your mind resisted the pattern. It searched for innocent explanations. It tried to protect the person because loyalty had become a habit. You said they would never do that. The observer did not argue. They only asked one more question. Then why does every obstacle begin after you tell them what you are planning? Silence. Again, reflection. Something inside you tightened. Not because you were convinced, but because a part of you had already asked the same question and buried it. Stay till the end because the name is not what will shock you most. What will shock you is how long your intuition had been trying to tell you the truth. You began remembering things differently after that. Conversations that once felt supportive now carried another meaning. Promises that had seemed kind now sounded calculated. You remembered how they insisted on meeting someone connected to your work, then later claimed the person did not trust you. You remembered how they warned others that you were overwhelmed, unreliable, or not ready, always disguising the damage as concern. You remembered moments when they discouraged you from speaking up, saying they were protecting you from embarrassment. But perhaps they were protecting themselves from being outgrown. The realization did not arrive all at once. It came in waves. First confusion. Then denial. Then the slow pain of understanding. You wanted proof. Not because you trusted them completely, but because accepting the truth would change too much. It would force you to question years of closeness. It would make you wonder which memories were real and which were performances. So you stayed quiet and watched. You stopped revealing your plans. You shared small pieces of false information, harmless details designed only to show where the leak began. You told one person one version, another person something different, and the person you suspected received a detail no one else knew. Days passed. Nothing happened. You almost felt guilty for doubting them. Then a message reached you from someone outside your circle. They repeated the exact detail you had shared only with that one person. Word for word. There it was. Not a feeling. Not a suspicion. Evidence. Your hands went cold as you stared at the screen. The person had not merely repeated your private words. They had changed the meaning around them. They had made your confidence sound like arrogance. Your caution sound like fear. Your ambition sound like desperation. And suddenly, every closed door made sense. Every strange look. Every unexplained delay. Every time someone withdrew without telling you why. The person close to you had been shaping a version of you behind your back, one that made others mistrust you before you even entered the room. Yet the deepest shock came when you asked yourself why. Why would someone who knew your struggles do this? Why would someone who had seen you rebuild yourself try to pull you backward? The answer was painfully simple. They did not hate you. They hated who they became when standing beside you. Your courage exposed their fear. Your discipline exposed their excuses. Your growth forced them to confront the life they had avoided creating. And instead of changing themselves, they tried to reduce you. That is the part people rarely admit. Sometimes betrayal does not come from an enemy who wants your destruction. It comes from a familiar person who wants you to remain small enough for them to feel secure. You confronted them gently. No shouting. No accusations thrown wildly. You simply placed the truth between you and waited. At first, they denied everything. Their eyes widened. Their voice became hurt. They asked how you could think so badly of them after everything they had done for you. They turned your discovery into your betrayal. But then you mentioned the private detail. The one no one else knew. Their expression changed. Only for a second. But you saw it. The pause. The breath. The calculation. And in that moment, the performance ended. They did not confess fully. People like this rarely do. They offered fragments. Excuses. They said they were only trying to protect you. They said others misunderstood. They said you had changed. There it was. You had changed. That was the truth hidden inside every lie. You had become harder to influence. Harder to frighten. Harder to keep inside the role they had chosen for you. They missed the version of you who asked permission. The version who shared every dream before taking action. The version who could be delayed with one doubtful sentence. But that person was gone. The observer had been right. Your intuition had been right. And now you had a choice. Revenge, confrontation, or distance. You chose distance. Not because the betrayal was small, but because your future was too important to keep explaining to someone committed to misunderstanding you. You stopped giving them access. Not only to your plans, but to your fears, your private hopes, and your unfinished decisions. You learned that forgiveness does not require continued proximity. You learned that peace sometimes begins when access ends. And slowly, things changed. Opportunities no longer disappeared mysteriously. Conversations became clearer. Your confidence returned. People began responding to the real you instead of the version someone else had created. The person who worked against you lost power the moment you stopped feeding them information. Their influence depended on your openness. Their advantage depended on your trust. Without those things, they had nothing. And now the name you have been waiting for. It may not be a lover, a stranger, or an obvious rival. It may be the friend who always needs to know everything first. The relative who disguises control as concern. The colleague who praises you loudly but weakens you privately. The person who says, "I only want what is best for you," while repeatedly guiding you away from what makes you stronger. Their exact name is already appearing inside your mind. You felt it before this story began. You may be resisting it even now. But do not rush into fear. Do not accuse without proof. Watch patterns. Protect your plans. Notice who celebrates your growth and who becomes distant when you succeed. Notice who brings peace and who leaves you confused. The truth does not need panic. It needs attention. Because the greatest protection is not suspicion of everyone. It is discernment. It is learning that closeness does not always mean loyalty, history does not guarantee honesty, and someone knowing your pain does not mean they deserve access to your future. You are not losing someone by seeing them clearly. You are losing the illusion that kept you tied to them. And sometimes, that loss is the beginning of freedom. The days that followed were quieter than you expected. Not because everything suddenly became perfect, but because silence has a strange way of revealing what noise was hiding. For the first time in a long while, you noticed how peaceful your thoughts felt when they were no longer shaped by someone else's opinions. There were still unanswered questions. There were still moments when old memories returned, tempting you to believe that perhaps you had misunderstood everything. After all, betrayal rarely arrives wearing the face of a stranger. It usually arrives carrying years of shared conversations, familiar laughter, and moments that once felt genuine. That is why the heart hesitates even after the mind begins to understand. You found yourself remembering birthdays, late-night conversations, promises that had once sounded sincere. And countless small moments that now felt impossible to judge. Were they real? Or had every smile been another carefully placed mask? The uncertainty was heavier than the betrayal itself. Yet life has an unusual habit of answering questions without words. As you quietly stepped away, something unexpected happened. The person who once seemed so confident suddenly became restless. They reached out more often than before. They asked where you had been. They wondered why you no longer shared every detail of your plans. Their messages became warmer, their concern became louder, and their compliments became more frequent. To anyone else, it might have looked like affection. But you had learned something important. Genuine care remains steady. Control becomes louder when it begins to disappear. Don't skip because this is where another hidden layer quietly reveals itself. The distance you created was not hurting them because they missed your company. It was hurting them because they no longer had access to your direction. They could no longer predict your next move. They could no longer prepare others before you arrived. They could no longer shape the story before you had the chance to tell it yourself. And without realizing it, they started exposing themselves. Small contradictions appeared in their conversations. Different people repeated different versions of the same story. One day they claimed they had always supported you. Another day they casually suggested that you were becoming difficult to understand. Their words no longer matched. Their performances began collapsing under their own weight. The observer watched all of this quietly. They never celebrated being right. They never reminded you that they had warned you before. Instead, they simply smiled with quiet relief because they knew something you were only beginning to discover. Truth never needs endless defending. Lies eventually become too heavy to carry. One afternoon, another conversation reached you unexpectedly. Someone you respected spoke with surprising honesty. They admitted that months earlier they had been warned about you. They had been told you were unreliable, impulsive, and impossible to trust with important responsibilities. At first they believed those stories because they came from someone who seemed genuinely concerned about your future. But after working with you directly, they realized nothing they had heard matched reality. Every prediction failed. Every accusation disappeared. Every doubt dissolved the moment they experienced your character for themselves. They apologized for believing those words. You accepted without resentment because you understood something new. Many people who doubted you were never your enemies. They were simply listening to the wrong narrator. Stay till the end because the greatest revelation has not arrived yet. It was never only about discovering who worked against you. It was about discovering who quietly believed in you despite everything they had been told. As the weeks passed, unexpected opportunities appeared. Not miraculous opportunities. Honest ones. Doors that opened because people finally met the real version of you instead of the version created through whispers. Conversations became easier. Decisions became clearer. Your confidence no longer depended on everyone's approval because you had finally learned the difference between acceptance and alignment. Some people are meant to walk beside your future. Others only want front row seats so they can quietly influence where it goes. The difference is rarely visible in the beginning. It becomes visible through patterns. Through consistency. Through how someone responds when your life begins improving instead of struggling. One evening, you crossed paths with the person again. There was no dramatic confrontation. No crowd. No raised voices. Just a quiet moment that carried years of unspoken history. They looked at you differently now. There was uncertainty where confidence once lived. They searched your face, perhaps hoping to find anger, disappointment, or the familiar version of you who would immediately explain every feeling. Instead, they found calm. That calm unsettled them more than any argument ever could. They asked if everything was all right between you. You answered honestly. Everything is finally clear. Those 5 words carried more weight than any accusation. They realized something had changed permanently. They could no longer guide your decisions through guilt. They could no longer reach your future through your kindness. For a brief moment, regret appeared across their face. Maybe it was genuine. Maybe it was simply the realization that influence had ended. You never discovered which one it was. And surprisingly, you no longer needed to know. Some questions stop mattering once peace arrives. As you walked away, you understood that the greatest victory was never exposing someone else's deception. It was refusing to let their deception become your identity. You were never the weak person they described. You were never the confused person they tried to create. You were simply someone who trusted deeply, and trust is not a flaw. It only becomes dangerous when it is offered without discernment. That lesson remained with you long after their voice faded from your life. From that day forward, you shared your dreams only with those who celebrated them without secretly competing against them. You protected unfinished plans until they became reality. You learned that silence is often the safest place for growing possibilities. Most importantly, you stopped confusing familiarity with loyalty. The people who truly belonged in your future never needed constant access to your private thoughts in order to support your success. They stood beside you without asking for control. They encouraged you without demanding credit. They celebrated your victories without comparing them to their own. And when you finally looked back on everything that had happened, the biggest surprise was not discovering who had quietly worked against you. The biggest surprise was realizing how strong you had become because of it. Sometimes the person trying to delay your journey accidentally teaches you exactly how to protect it. Sometimes betrayal becomes the reason wisdom finally takes root. And sometimes the name that once shocked you becomes nothing more than a chapter you no longer need to revisit, because your future has already moved somewhere their influence can never reach. Morning arrived without ceremony, yet something about the day felt different. There was no dramatic sign waiting outside your window, no unexpected message promising that everything had finally changed. Instead, there was a quiet certainty that had settled inside you during the night. For the first time in months, your next decision belonged entirely to you. No second guessing. No searching for hidden approval. No wondering how someone else might react if you succeeded. The silence that once felt uncomfortable had become your greatest ally because it gave you room to hear your own thoughts again. As the hours passed, you noticed something unexpected. The people who genuinely cared about you did not demand explanations for your distance. They simply respected it. They asked how you were doing instead of asking what you were planning. They celebrated your small victories without trying to turn the conversation back toward themselves. It was a simple difference, yet it revealed everything. Real support does not compete with your progress. It quietly strengthens it. That realization changed the way you looked at every relationship in your life. You no longer measured people by how long they had known you. You measured them by how they responded when your life began moving forward. Some became happier with every step you took. Others became strangely quieter. Their encouragement faded. Their curiosity increased. They wanted details they had never cared about before. But this time you recognized the pattern. You smiled, answered only what needed to be answered, and kept the most important parts of your journey protected. It was not secrecy. It was wisdom earned through experience. Weeks later, another unexpected truth surfaced. Someone who had once kept their distance approached you with an apology. They admitted they had believed stories that painted you as difficult, unreliable, and impossible to trust. Those stories had shaped their opinion long before they ever met you. But after working beside you, every assumption disappeared. They realized the person they had been warned about did not exist. The image had been carefully constructed by someone who feared what you might become. Hearing those words no longer filled you with anger. Instead, they confirmed something you had already begun to understand. False stories can travel quickly, but they rarely survive direct experience. Character has a way of revealing itself over time, no matter how many shadows are placed around it. That evening, as you reflected on everything that had happened, another question quietly entered your mind. Why had you ignored your instincts for so long? The answer was surprisingly gentle. Because you believed the best about people. Because you valued loyalty. Because you assumed that those closest to you wanted the same happiness you wished for them. None of those qualities were weaknesses. They only needed balance. Trust without awareness becomes vulnerability. Awareness without trust becomes isolation. Somewhere between those two extremes, wisdom begins to grow. As the seasons changed, your life continued opening in ways you had once hoped for but never expected. Opportunities appeared naturally because you were no longer carrying the invisible weight of constant doubt. Conversations flowed more easily. Decisions became clearer. Your confidence no longer depended on convincing everyone that your dreams were worthwhile. You simply pursued them. The people meant to walk beside you remained. The ones who needed control quietly drifted away. Looking back, you realized the greatest lesson had never been about identifying one person who secretly worked against you. It was about learning to recognize the difference between those who protect your peace and those who quietly disturb it. From then on, you chose your circle with greater care, your words with greater intention, and your future with greater courage. And although the chapter began with betrayal, it ended with something far more valuable, a life no longer shaped by hidden opposition, but by clear purpose, quiet confidence, and the freedom that comes from finally seeing people as they truly are rather than as you hoped they would be. The final truth did not arrive with a confession, a dramatic confrontation, or a message that explained everything. It arrived through consistency. Day after day, you watched your life become lighter simply because you stopped allowing the wrong person to influence your decisions. At first the change was almost impossible to notice. Conversations felt calmer. Your thoughts no longer circled around the same doubts. You began making choices without wondering how someone else would interpret them. Then the changes became impossible to ignore. Opportunities that once disappeared without explanation started remaining open. People who had once seemed distant became welcoming after spending time with you directly. Your confidence no longer depended on defending your character because your actions spoke more clearly than any rumor ever could. Looking back, you realized that the greatest damage had never come from the words spoken behind your back. It came from the moments when you almost believed those words yourself. That was the real battle. The quiet temptation to shrink your dreams, question your instincts, and accept a smaller version of your future simply because someone close to you could not imagine anything greater. Once you understood that, everything changed. You stopped explaining yourself to people committed to misunderstanding you. You stopped chasing approval from those who had already decided who you were. Most importantly, you stopped confusing history with trust. Just because someone had been present for many years did not mean they deserved unlimited access to the years ahead. The observer who had first warned you smiled when they saw the difference in your eyes. They noticed that your shoulders no longer carried invisible weight. Your laughter returned without hesitation. Your decisions carried certainty instead of apology. They never asked whether you had forgiven the person who worked against you because they already knew the answer. Forgiveness had happened quietly. Not as permission for the betrayal, but as freedom from carrying it forever. You no longer needed revenge because your peace had become a greater victory than any argument could ever provide. One afternoon you crossed paths with that familiar face one last time. There was no anger between you, only distance created by truth. They tried to begin an ordinary conversation as though nothing had changed. For a moment you remembered the years of friendship, the shared memories, the countless ordinary days that had once seemed genuine. Those memories still existed, but they no longer controlled your judgment. You responded politely, wished them well, and continued walking toward the life you had worked so hard to protect. As you walked away, you realized something surprising. You did not feel triumph. You felt relief. The chapter had finally ended. Not because the other person admitted everything, but because you no longer required their admission in order to move forward. Some stories never receive perfect explanations. Some betrayals never receive complete confessions. Yet healing remains possible because closure is not always something another person gives you. Sometimes it is a decision you quietly make for yourself. From that day onward, your habits reflected everything you had learned. You spoke less about unfinished dreams and invested more energy into completing them. You surrounded yourself with people who celebrated progress instead of competing with it. You listened carefully to actions instead of being persuaded by beautiful words. Whenever someone encouraged you, you watched whether their behavior matched their encouragement over time. That simple habit protected you from repeating the same mistake. As the months passed, your success became impossible to ignore. Not because it arrived suddenly, but because it grew steadily without constant interference. The confidence you gained was different from the confidence you once chased. It was quieter, stronger. It no longer depended on applause. It came from knowing that your direction belonged to you alone. Every achievement reminded you of one important lesson: the people who genuinely care about your future never fear your growth. They never become uncomfortable when your light becomes brighter. They do not secretly compete with your happiness or hope that your progress slows down enough for them to feel secure. Instead, they become stronger by watching you become stronger. They understand that another person's success is not a threat but an inspiration. That is the kind of company worth protecting. In time, you discovered something even more meaningful. The painful experience had not made you suspicious of everyone. Instead, it had made you wiser about everyone. There is a profound difference between living in fear and living with discernment. Fear closes every door. Discernment simply chooses the right ones to open. Because of that wisdom, your future relationships became healthier, your friendships became deeper, and your peace became far more difficult for anyone to disturb. Looking back on everything, the title of this story no longer felt like its greatest revelation. Yes, someone close to you had quietly worked against you. Yes, their identity had been unexpected. But the real surprise was discovering your own resilience. You survived confusion without losing kindness. You survived betrayal without becoming bitter. You survived disappointment without abandoning hope. That became the greatest victory of all. The person who once tried to influence your path eventually became only a memory, while the lessons they unintentionally taught remained with you every single day. Those lessons guided you toward better opportunities, stronger relationships, and a life built on clarity instead of illusion. And if there is one final truth worth carrying beyond this story, it is this: not everyone who walks beside you is meant to travel with you forever. Some people enter your life to share your journey, while others unknowingly prepare you for the people who truly belong in your future. Never measure loyalty by how long someone has known you. Measure it by how they respond when you begin becoming the person you were always capable of becoming. The right people will never ask you to become smaller so they can feel bigger. They will never celebrate your failures more quietly than your successes. They will never need your uncertainty to protect their own confidence. They will simply stand beside you with honesty, consistency, and respect. That is the kind of presence that deserves a place in your life. And with that understanding, you finally stopped looking behind you. The chapter closed, not with fear, but with peace. Not with revenge, but with freedom. Not with another secret, but with a quiet certainty that no hidden opposition could ever be stronger than a future built on truth, wisdom, and the courage to keep moving forward. The story that began with betrayal ended with clarity, and clarity became the beginning of everything that came next.